Hello and welcome to Lowy Institute Conversations, a podcast in which Lowy Institute researchers and leading experts delve into the big issues in international affairs. My name's Sam Roggeveen. I'm Director of the International Security Program at the Lowy Institute. And today I welcome Lydia Khalil, Director of the Transnational Challenges Program here at the Lowy Institute. And we're here to talk about democratic erosion, a global phenomenon which has been tracked by various organisations that monitor regime types around the world. And all of them indicate that democracy, or should I say liberal democracy, we'll get into that, is in recession on a global basis. Now, the causes of democratic erosion are multiple and interconnected, and they are the subject of a new research product that you can find on the Lowy Institute's website. And like all our research, it's free. It's a digital interactive tool called Understanding Democratic Erosion, and Lydia Khalil is one of its co-authors alongside Peter Woodrow, James Patterson, and Robert Kaufman. Lydia, hello and welcome.
Hi, Sam. Thanks for having me on the podcast. It's good to talk to you about this.
Indeed. Now, let's start with those global indices that I referred to. What are they all saying about the state of democracy around the world?
So a lot of what they're saying about the state of global democracy is not good. But first, maybe we can give listeners a little bit of context of what we thought about democracy and the direction of democracy and where it would go before that. So in this first quarter of the 21st century, we're really starting to see that democracy is in trouble around the globe. And that's a significant change from what was predicted. So you had in the early 90s, at the end of the Cold War, democracy was seen as almost an inevitability. It was seen as being tied to human rights, and in a sense that it was considered a universal good, something that was universally applicable across countries and societal contexts. There was this famous essay by the Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen, who wrote Democracy as a Universal Value. And this was a big contrast with the way democracy was thought of, where certain countries were thought as not being quite fit, quote unquote, fit for democracy. And you also had arguments like Francis Fukuyama's End of History, where he argued that liberal democracy was the most attractive regime type. And his thesis is a bit understood. I don't think he was saying that there's no further historical developments, but that liberal democracy essentially won the battle of ideas and ideology. Now, you also had a lot of evidence to support it, where there was this big democratizing wave in the 80s and 90s, where many countries were emerging out of dictatorship and communism. And now we're seeing that wave reverse. So instead of a democratizing wave, we're starting to see an autocratizing wave. And these global indices that you talk about pretty much universally, the ones that measure democracy, whether it's VDEM, Varieties of Democracy, the Economist Intelligence Unit, IDEA, Freedom House, they have measured a steady 2-decade decline in democracies globally, both in the number of countries that are counted as full liberal democracies, and also declines within certain democracies themselves around the quality of that. The VDEM Institute report was the one that got a lot of headlines around the world, because they said that the world now has fewer democracies than autocracies for the first time in more than 20 years. It's important, I think, to say that these measures are imperfect, they're subjective to an extent, but the trend line is pretty clear.
And what is it they're measuring, Lydia? Because it can't be just voting, can it?
They're measuring things like how free and fair elections are. They're measuring things around rights and liberties, how they're guaranteed. They're measuring things around institutional checks and balances. So in each one of them have various indices, and you can go and reference them and you can see how they measure. And like I said, when you're talking about things like political and social context, there is a degree of subjectivity at play, or there's some contestation at play, but they're measuring things across those various indices. So it's not just about elections.
The measurement part is almost the easy part, although noting your point that it can be subjective, and I'm sure there are difficulties in assigning ratings to various aspects of liberal democracy that are hard to pin down. But even acknowledging that, the measurement is almost the easy part of the task. The harder part is figuring out why this apparently global phenomena is occurring. And that's what your Democracy Erosion project was all about, right? And so say a little bit more about the project, but also about what you think the main factors are for for why liberal democratic erosion is occurring.
So the project was trying to delve into not only why it was happening, but how it was happening. But to your question about why this is all happening, there's obviously a lot of reasons. There's a lot of theories why. I'll try to give you maybe some headlines about what some of the ones that seem most impactful. So one of the big theses around why democracies are declining is around the ability of democracies to deliver. So you take a look at citizen surveys in democracies, and citizens are feeling that democracies are not able to deliver on their needs. They're not providing adequate services. There's a lack of economic mobility. There's growing economic inequality. Democracy is not working the way it's supposed to. People are just increasingly dissatisfied. There's a feeling that elected leaders are more serving their needs and are more interested in holding into power rather than serving the people. And so when we're talking about dissatisfaction and that inability to deliver, we're talking about things like economic performance, like I said, governments, but also the ability to address complex challenges where we're entering into an ever more complex system. There's a lot of talk around multiple crises, multiple challenges, whether it be on the economic front or with climate change or lots of different social issues, dealing with major technological disruptions. So there is a feeling that democracy can't deliver on that. And so what happens is that provides an opening for anti-democratic actors to come in and say, well, I've got the answers. And it provides an opening within the citizens themselves where people are open to those alternative solutions if democracy is not delivering.
Is it clear from the evidence that democratic governments are failing in their delivery more than they used to? So in other words, what I'm saying is when the public says that democracies are no longer delivering, are they right in the objective sense or are they feeling something subjective?
It almost doesn't much matter. If there is that sentiment within the population that is the case, then that has just as much of an impact on democratic erosion. I think, too, there's a sense that maybe expectations have risen in one hand, but also if you do take a look at measurements around, say, growing income and wealth inequality, right, which is one of the things I was going to point to that's very related, that objectively is the case. And that's a big one in terms of at least understanding one of the reasons why democratic erosion is happening in more established and consolidated democracies. So we know that there is growing wealth and income inequality in many of these contexts. And studies have shown, there was a recent large study out of University of Chicago, I think, where it pointed to economic inequality as being one of the strongest predictors of where and when a democracy erodes. Because we see inequality driving this dissatisfaction, driving polarization, providing openings, again, for populist and anti-democratic leaders. And so another thing, again, related, you can see how they kind of fall on each other. It's kind of like a domino effect. Polarization in many democratic societies is also growing. Now, when we say polarization, we're not talking just about disagreement, because disagreement is to be expected in democracies. It's actually a system that is put in place to deal with disagreement and use disagreement as a vehicle for governance and for progress. But when we're talking about polarization, we're talking about a deep-seated hostility between groups. One side sees the other side as an existential threat. And so that is a real erosion of a key democratic norm. And again, you see these anti-democratic leaders and populist leaders trying to exploit this. So when you have high degrees of polarization, people will turn a blind eye or they'll overlook democratic violation if they feel it prevents the other side from gaining power. And if you see the other side as this existential threat or a major enemy, not just a political opponent, then that is a huge driver of democratic erosion. I suppose the last thing I'd point to, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, is that the information environment is really different. So the digital technologies, what the internet is doing, has had a big impact. The internet in the beginning considered an open door to democracy and to liberty, but now it's seen more of as an agent of democratic erosion.
Well, I mean, it should already be very clear to the listeners how multifaceted and how interrelated all these phenomena are. And you've only mentioned a few of them that appear in your index. It's worth stressing to listeners that this is an interactive tool that users can use and manipulate. Could you very briefly explain how it works and what users can get out of it?
We basically break down this interactive in a way where we try to explain how democratic erosion happens. And we see it as a three-piece dynamic where you have certain facilitating conditions of democratic erosions, like the ones that we talked about. And in the interactive, you can go and click on and get further explanations and elaborations on the conditions we talked about and a variety of others. But then we say that those conditions are not sufficient, right? You actually have to have actors in the process. Actors are really important because, democracy is about a system of actors. It's about the people and what they do and the power that they hold. So what are the actors doing? And then you can take a look at the various actors that we identify within a democratic society, whether they be political leaders or the media or the education system or civil society, and talk about how those actors can exploit these facilitating conditions in a way and how they contribute to democratic erosion. And then lastly, the third piece is we try to look at it systematically. So we say these actors exploit these various conditions, but what's the how of what they're doing? And so we say that it's systematic. Democracy is a system. And so there's certain systems and processes and pathways that you can take a look at. And through systems mapping, we put together a systems map where you can explore how these things interlink. So how polarization gets exploited by, say, an anti-democratic leader who then turns that potentially into promotion of political violence. And through the systems map, what you also see and are able to identify are the reinforcing dynamics, the reinforcing loops that lead to democratic erosion. So we say it's not just enough that, say, there's a few isolated instances here or there, but what we're really trying to identify is what are the kind of reinforcing dynamics that are at play around democratic erosion.
I do want to latch on to one specific thing that you mentioned there, which is the role of political violence. And I know that recurs over and over in the literature about democratic erosion. And of course, it's become very prominent over the last few days since the news of the assassination of Charlie Kirk, the conservative political activist in the United States. Just tell me how you reflect on political violence in democratic erosion.
Engaging in political violence is really one of the most serious violations of democratic norms, and it's a serious sign of democratic breakdown if there is many or repeated instances of it. Even one instance of political violence can be damaging if it's high profile enough. Democracy is a system that its very purpose is to transition power and to resolve disputes without the use of violence or without takeover or coup. And I think what's the assassination of the political activist Charlie Kirk is demonstrating that we're seeing really dangerous levels of political violence in the United States. And the United States is one of those countries that's pointed to as being an exemplar of this idea of democratic erosion. It's quite troubling considering that the United States is the world's most powerful and longstanding democracy. So what we're seeing is the U.S. is wading into these ever darker waters. It's not just Charlie Kirk's killing, and this is what I mean by repetitive instances of it. So before he was killed, there was also a string of other attempts and murders of political activists and elected officials, President Trump being prominent among him. You also had an attempted attack on Nancy Pelosi in her house, which injured her husband. You've had assassination plots and kidnapping plots against state governors in the United States, killings of congressional representatives and attacks against them. And of course, you had the January 6th riots, which was deeply troubling in terms of indications of democratic erosion, because not only was there violence there, it was a rejection of electoral outcomes, which is another big violation of democratic norms. And so this repeated instances of political violence in a democracy is a serious, serious risk factor in terms of a country's kind of decline in democracy.
So let me offer a slight provocation here just to get your reaction to it. And it's about the United States, but it could be about any country that is witnessing democratic erosion. And it really goes to the question of how difficult it is to break out of these trends and whether it's actually something that can be stopped and reversed. So, I mean, the United States has suffered these kind of controversies and restrictions on liberal democratic norms throughout its history. Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War. Franklin Roosevelt notoriously, put Japanese Americans in concentration camps during the Second World War. There are countless examples. Arguably, the George W. Bush presidency had bigger implications for the separation of powers in the United States than the Trump administration currently is. And yet the United States throughout its history seems to, over time, will take a couple of steps forward and take another step back. Within very near-term memory for all of us, for instance, is the fact that Americans elected Barack Obama as their president, right? The first ever Black American president, last middle name of Hussein, let's not forget that part. He oversaw a big victory for liberal values through the marriage equality legislation, for instance. So it's not one-way traffic. What do you say to the broader point that what we've been describing so far is purely cyclical and that the tide will turn once again?
Well, a lot of the things you mentioned, particularly about the United States, is something that I think a lot about too, especially when I'm trying to assess in my own thinking, okay, where is the United States heading? And I point to a lot of the similar things that you speak about. The United States has always been quite a revolutionary society. It's always had a lot of violence. It came about through a revolution. We had equally high levels of political violence in the 1960s and the 1970s. And the United States seemed to have come out of that as well. So we do see this cyclical nature in the United States. I haven't resolved it quite in my own mind, whether this is another cycle, whether this one is maybe potentially a deeper cycle, or whether we're seeing something really fundamentally different. I think the important thing to note, particularly about the United States, is that it wasn't really a full democracy where everyone had universal rights until the 1960s. So yes, it's considered one of the world's oldest democracies, but there wasn't universal rights and suffrage until the 1960s. So if we're talking about the US as a democracy, you can say, okay, well, was it from the revolution in 1776? Or are we talking about 1960 when you had the civil rights legislation and you had those universal rights and suffrage? So if you look at it from the 1960s, it's actually quite a short-lived full liberal democracy. One of the things that I can't quite resolve and I continue to question is whether this is a major fundamental shift. And one of the things that potentially may be pointing to a steeper decline where the cycle may be more difficult to reverse this time around, I think are two things. One of them is that information and technology environment that we're talking about, where in previous instances, you didn't have digital technology, you didn't have the internet that was scrambling our brains and driving polarization, and basically making massive fundamental transformations to our societies, to our psychologies, to our economics, all sorts of things, let alone what's going to be happening or is currently happening with AI. And I think the second thing is that in previous iterations, while there were populist leaders in the United States, Andrew Jackson, for example, is Trump something different in that he's a symptom of, I think, this democratic erosion, but he's using his position of power, the bully pulpit, to drive some of these dynamics. And so if we're talking about the United States, this is really where my thinking is oscillating.
Well, I'll offer a slight glass half full perspective on the media environment, which is that there's strong evidence that in previous media revolutions that we've also had, if you like, moral panics about society's ability to cope. I mean, I follow an account on Twitter which notes previous instances of deep sort of cultural pessimism, and you can find examples from the 19th century about the novel corrupting minds. People are reading too many novels. And of course, you hear that about the beginning of the newspaper era, and then about radio, and of course about television. So, I guess none of that is definitive. The only thing I would caution is that the internet revolution and the social media revolution are still so young in those terms. There is so much more that could happen. We have barely begun to understand what it is we're actually embarked upon, for good and ill. Lydia, I just wanted to close with the little time we have left on the question of the distinction between liberal and illiberal democracies. Is populism just another way of saying illiberal democracy? And can we actually draw a sharp distinction here that liberalism has maybe overreached in the more mature Western countries to the detriment of democracy, and that we're seeing a kind of correction to that?
Yeah, possibly. But I think what your question is pointing to is that democracy can actually come in many forms and guises. So you have representative democracy, you've got participatory democracy, deliberative democracy, all sorts of different things. And there are people who argue that we should distinguish between liberal and illiberal democracy, where you say liberal democracies is more focused about protecting a set of values and ideas, where actually people are believed to be free, equal, possessing inalienable rights and liberties. Liberal democracy is also about protecting people from the government and from government overreach, right? Liberal democracy is about standing apart from majority sentiment. So while majoritarianism does tend to drive decision-making in democracies, in a liberal democracy, you want to guard against the tyranny of the majority. And I think your point about populism, that's kind of where liberal democracies can guard against that. In illiberal democracies, okay, you have elections, sure, but there's not mechanisms to protect those rights and liberties and checks and balances. So you might have elections, but you have more limitations on freedom of the press, association, various rights. And again, those checks and balances really aren't there. Illiberal democracies are becoming more common, but one way to describe illiberal democracy, another way, is actually an electoral autocracy. And so you have people who argue that a democracy without liberalism is not a democracy. So for an example of, say, a liberal democracy can look like Hungary right now, where you have concentration in the power of the executive, curtailing your rights and liberties, but you do have elections. Illiberal democracies as well, or these electoral autocracies, or however you want to call them, they're problematic because with this illiberalism, you often have a breakdown in the rule of law, or the law is geared toward advantaging particular segments of society or particular elites. Now, a really interesting counterexample, I think, to my general outlook on illiberal democracy, because I think I'm within that camp that would say an illiberal democracy is not really a democracy. But one really interesting counterexample, I think, that challenges my thinking is Singapore, which I find fascinating because it's not a liberal democracy. It performs, very mid, I guess, as the kids would say, on many metrics of democracy, like representation, rights, participations. But it ranks very high on the rule of law. And it's a high trust society. And it provides services and benefits, although that is now being challenged as well about this trend of growing inequality. And in many other ways, it's actually highly participatory. The government engages in extensive consultation in other ways. It's kind of baked into their governing model. And they work very hard to uphold trust in institutions. And they work very hard to safeguard multiculturalism within their society and not let that get into entrenched divisions and polarization, as we've saw. But it's a very top-down approach. A lot of rights that are curtailed in that. So that's a very interesting example of how things are not quite so clear-cut. While I'll always be someone who believes that democracy is, the best of the imperfect systems, there are examples out there where it shows that we have to think about these in a bit more of a nuanced way.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Lydia. I'm afraid that's all the time we have. You've been listening to Lowy Institute Conversations, a podcast hosted by Institute experts and produced by Andrew Griffiths. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to joining you on the next episode. Bye for now.